Friends, hello again. So we're doing Chaos Kings, part three, and I think that Scott is going to answer some questions in the beginning. And then what chapter did we stop at?
We stopped at chapter 12, so we're getting about 6 chapters per recording.
And you have a lot of chapters.
We have 24 chapters,
Okay, we may
so
have to compress at some point.
yeah, I think towards the end there's some we can skim over. Um, but these ones we're in the middle of now are pretty good and very relevant to you and your story. I think we got to the end of chapter 12, but there was one part at the end that I wanted to bring up that's pretty relevant to what we've been talking about, which is perceptions of different kinds of risks and how we should think about them and prepare for them. And the anecdote comes from uh, 2012 when you went to Tufts University in Massachusetts, and you were on stage, you're giving a talk, and you were having a conversation with Nadim Shahadi, an expert in Middle Eastern Eastern Mediterranean studies. And at the time, if people can remember, back in 2015, ISIS was rampaging around in Iraq and causing a lot of trouble. And he asked you about that. He said there's a panic in the West about ISIS jihadists who return from Syria. And is this some? He was asking, what are you most concerned about right now? So he brought up ISIS, and you said, I have no clue about that. This is so minor currently as a source of risk. And then you went on to say, if you look at the risks we face on a daily basis, the real risks are not ISIS. That's bullshit. The real risk was Ebola, because Ebola can spread, Ebola can accelerate and spread. The next Ebola we'll be facing for the first time in history is an epidemic that flies on British Air and, of course, Delta, and gets bad food on United and bad treatment by flight attendants. So that's a problem. We never face it. So when people tell me, let's talk about risk, the first thing I talk about, ISIS could accelerate it or come naturally, is an epidemic.
Okay, yeah,
Um,
that's in line with our discussion about the idea that the lowest tail exponent, hence the one that produces the more uh, consequential gray swans, is pandemics. So we said wars and pandemics. Pandemics
mhm,
is, are actually worse than in the past. They have a scale that's different because things spread much faster.
right. Yeah, and this is something that you wrote about with Yanir Baryam in that paper in 2020, and it just it's one of many instances that I found looking at your writing and your talks over the years that you continually were emphasizing the risks of a pandemic over
It
almost
is
anything
so
else.
exactly. It's so mind-boggling that people fail to get the difference between things that are multiplicative and things that are additive.
Yeah.
And it
So how
is.
does that differ from ISIS, which was causing a panic
I mean,
at the
ISIS.
time? Nobody was thinking about epidemics.
I mean, like they have weapons, they can kill people. People can kill one another. They're non-state agents. There's a multiplicative effect in the sense that religious fundamentalism can spread,
Mhm.
but it's not. I mean, it's within the basins of known historical patterns, and for you to become an ISIS member, it's going to be very. It will need a lot of convincing. Whereas for you to get a virus, it's much less work on the part of Mother Nature. You see, so
Right.
this is why I thought that it was not, and as a matter of fact, that the damage caused by uh, the classes of thing is reduced.
Right.
I mean,
It's
we have
more
some kind of
localized.
exactly. We have had all kind of rebellious movements coming out of the Near East. I would just read biblical history. Um, and of course, it's a pattern. Okay, you have sects that come and riot and then go away.
Yeah. Um, okay, so the next chapter is focusing back on Universa and its story and a pretty significant event in the history of the hedge fund, which is its relationship with CalPERS. So the story tells how in 2016, Universe was contacted by CalPERS and a dialogue opened up with the pension fund. And for people who don't know, CalPERS is this giant California pension fund with many, many billions of dollars uh, under management. Um, could you talk just briefly about why Universa could be a good investment for a pension fund like CalPERS?
It is tail clipping. I would leave it at that. It's
Mhm.
covered as tail clipping, and people fail to get that two things. Number one, you should never analyze a strategy on its own. Like as we discussed before, you never look at the cost of an insurance. Look at a package, car plus insurance.
Mhm.
Say that you're doing a cost benefit analysis of using a car plus insurance versus taking the subway or public transportation. So your costs are not separable. It's the same thing. And then the other concept is if you really believe in stocks, if you are in stocks, you must believe in stocks or in the necessity of owning stocks. If you really believe in stocks and you believe in that story that of like stocks for the long term and all that thing, then the strategy allows you to be longer. So you got to look at the offsetting of whatever cost, assuming the strategy has cost. In fact, it turned out it didn't have cost, but uh, that's not what we're doing it. So assuming the strategy has cost, the extra 10% or whatever, or 20% you can own in stocks, offset that and a lot more.
Right.
This is why
That that's
that was the idea.
as opposed to the traditional strategy of putting a 30-40% into bonds or something like that that's lower risk.
Yeah, we actually I did a paper with someone who was at CalPERS and then joined Universa, and we looked at that nonsense that I had explored technically before, called non-ellipticality, that nonsense about using correlation on the fat tails, but we made it very simple and very practical, and what people think is empirical, as we went through history. There's the correlation flips. So you're overexposed, underexposed, number one.
Mhm.
It never has any stable properties. And that idea of stock bonds doesn't come from portfolio theory, although people always look for some quantitative theoretical explanation, but from the fact that in the 80s, if you bought stocks, all right, you could offset some of your swings with the high income from bonds. Bonds had a huge yield. And
Yeah.
such a strategy, in addition, such a strategy would, in addition, give you huge profits on the bonds. Rates were overnight rates were in the 20s, early to low 20s. The long-term bonds were in the high teens and mid-teens. So you realize that when interest rates go from 15% to 1% over so many years, that you're going to have a huge profit on your bond position. So that was the justification, is to hold bonds. But then when we looked at it, I said, these idiots are holding bonds at 1%. That's a completely different story, number one. And two, that illusion of diversification comes from the fact that they wanted an incentive color to the story of holding bonds. I mean, it's a great idea to hold bonds, but I just like to hold bonds. Not that I'm doing some kind of portfolio nonsense. And for diversification to work, you must have a stable correlation structure. No stable correlation,
Yeah.
no diversification.
And what you're saying in fat tails or black swans, correlations, historical correlations get blown up basically. They don't work the way they used to. They can reverse, they can flip,
They
they
do,
can
yeah, they do actually do weird things. In a long
yeah.
career in the markets, I have seen, like, say, this, in stock market crash of '87, the bond market was up 10 points. Mortgages were up like 1/32nd. And a lot of
Mm,
people were short bonds, long mortgages. That's the trick of LTCM. You sell bonds and own something that's higher yielding. And of course, we saw it again with LTCM. Everything LTCM was short went up in value. Everything they were long went down in value. So forget about correlation. It's
yeah.
the passengers on that bus, right, that matter.
Yeah,
Not
it's deleveraging basically that goes across asset classes. So things that are supposed to be, move inversely, suddenly the correlation goes to one because everybody's selling everything.
yeah.
So it just the whole diversification strategy blows up in their face.
Plus,
But that doesn't happen with the universal strategy.
yeah, but then again, there's no structure to that correlation between these asset classes, aside from the fact that it makes no sense. Um, uh, practically, it also makes no sense. Theoretically, you require a fixed correlation, or at least a correlation that moves within, noise.
Hmm.
And we showed that the move and correlation were too random to allow for all that stuff.
Yeah.
And
So, I mean, but your history shows that the inverse correlation between far out of the money uh, put options does work.
yeah, of course, it's not a correlation anymore. It's an organic link. You see,
Yeah.
it's a put is on the underlying. It's not on something else. Like some people have tried to buy puts on um, the German stock index to hedge a position in the UK index simply because one was cheaper or something like that. And then there's again you have a correlation, and often actually a competitor blew up because uh, one market moved and not the other.
Mhm.
So you with zero, you don't target correlation. You don't look at it. You just hedge a thing by itself.
Right. Okay. So the next chapter is chapter 14. Um, and it kind of goes back to the beginning, circles back to the beginning of the book, uh, which is COVID. So the narrative goes through the CalPERS investment, the work done with the CalPERS team. Uh, Universa starts managing, billions of dollars for CalPERS. Now we're at the beginning of COVID. Um, and there's a scene with you're in Miami, if you remember this in the beginning of 2020, and you're having a discussion with Mark and Brandon about what should be done to respond to this risk, this pandemic risk. And I got pieces of this from talking to you and Mark. And Mark says, the consummate libertarian. He basically says governments get involved with things, they just make things worse. Uh, and you disagree with this. You say this is
I am
the extreme situation,
I am
and
liber I also have libertarian tendencies, but then I
Yeah,
go
I know.
bringing up Hayek and von Mises, that libertarian means the government should stay outside the the economic field because they're not good at it. But it doesn't mean the government should not work on law enforcement, protecting citizens. And for Hayek, the government is there for wars, pandemics, and some other functions that individuals can do. So it's sort of like a subsidiarity thing, is that the municipality takes care of what municipalities are good at, and the federal government should just deal with things that are reserved for the federal government. But pandemics was one of them, and the measures that could have been done at the federal level would have simplified the problem greatly. Like, for example, let's say lock out, not lock in, or
Mhm.
check people for infections at the airport. Then you're doing a de facto quarantine. In the past, they used to quarantine people without knowing if they're infected or not. They had no way of knowing. Today we know, and then therefore quarantine those who are infected. I mean, it's they're very simple measures, and we had to wait a year and 2 months for these measures to be implemented. This is a very strange story.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this discussion was being had, the one between you and Mark, throughout the country, and we saw it sort of warp the public dialogue about response. And you know, you had a big backlash against mandates on masking or keeping schools
I mean,
closed.
the mandates on masking are just simply to protect other citizens, not to protect the person, just in case, we're not even sure. We didn't have evidence. We don't need evidence that masks work, no more than we have evidence that parachutes work. There's no controlled experiment to see if parachutes work, yet we use parachutes.
Mhm.
So masks for me were a robust, protection in the beginning before you figure out what's going on, and for people not to
Yeah,
infect one another. And people who are critical of masks didn't get that compounding effect. Like if I have 50% chance of infecting you and you have 50% chance reduction, if I have a reduction of 50% and you have a reduction of 50%, the combined is not 50%. So it is, there's a compounding effect. So, and then plus, if you reduce the viral load by 20 or 30%, you may reduce the infection rate by 90%. There are other nonlinearities. These
yeah.
appear later. They're more obvious now than they were at the time. Appeared later. Yanir and I worked a lot on masks, but the measures, basically, the fact of the cost of not panicking early, the measures that were taken were very costly. And what did the government do? And that was under Trump.
Hmm.
Write checks, and now we're paying consequences now. So you realize that we're suffering from the economic cost of governments who got involved in economic activity. Rather than just control borders or work on things that only federal government can do.
Hmm. I mean, do you see this as being a difference between you and Mark? Like he's a ultra libertarian who just
No,
doesn't think
it's a matter
anything
of
government
nuances.
does is.
It's a matter of nuances. Okay,
Mhm.
is what should the government? I'm not libertarian in the sense. I'm a classic liberal. Okay,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
you end up having some issues with libertarians.
no,
Uh,
libertarians talk about personal liberty. I mean, I've invoked papers written by libertarians about on that support entirely what's supposed to be non-libertarian governments were doing. All right. So the idea of seeing government interference in places where you need the government is, I think, often very childish. But Mark is, nuanced. He's not. But a lot of so-called libertarians today have no idea about the people they're citing, about the works of these
mm,
people they're citing. I mean,
Right.
consensus was in favor of the draft. You see,
They're
so
in favor of
these
the
are,
draft.
yeah, from ISIS. Okay,
Hmm.
so I mean, so the whole thing, and he himself, I mean, there are passages where he explains. He said, "I don't consider the state a necessary evil. I don't even consider the state evil. I just want the state to be outside economic activity." Because simply the state is not good at it. That's not the business of the state. And the weird thing is that it's the environment that decides government policy in the United States, not individuals. Because under Trump, we had the first socialist measures in the history of this country, universal basic income, you see, and then also saving corporations.
Oh, you mean the care bailouts for
Yeah,
COVID?
yeah,
Yeah.
that never happened. So in other words, whether you had it was a Trump or Biden, they may insult one another. Now Biden's out, but they may insult one another all they want. They respond to the environment in the very same way. You see, so it's the environment driving the risk aversion of the environment is driving policy, and you got to recognize that. And
Hmm.
knowing that, you should act early because you know you're going to act, and it's going to cost a lot more money later. So
Yeah.
I'm not against helping people who are in trouble. I'm against the uh, systematic and blind measures just throwing money at the problem, not knowing that when you throw money at a problem, you have a side effect. If they knew about a side effect, they would have acted differently. But as usual, they don't think it's about a second or third step.
Right. Okay. So the uh, the next chapter is called Lottery Tickets, and it gets into what became an infamous decision by CalPERS and its new manager at the time, an individual named Ben Meng, to exit the Universa position um, just before COVID hit. Notoriously, historically bad timing. Um, I looked at some of the comments that he made at the time justifying this decision, and part of it is part of his reasoning is a uh, argument made by AQR, an AQR asset manager called Antti Ilmanen,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
he wrote a couple papers. One in particular that I look at: do financial markets reward buying or selling insurance and lottery tickets? And I think you're familiar with this. He concluded that I think what he called the Spitznagel-Taleb strategy uh, of or I know he cited your strategy. He basically said by selling volatility on either the left tail or the right tail adds value in the long run, whereas buying tail risk insurance results in poor long run results. And this is, Ben Meng cited this uh, research for a reason to exit the strategy. Um, his results are converse to the experience of Empirica and Universa. Um, what? How do you counter Ilmanen's
Well, I mean,
conclusion?
I did counter Ilmanen, but he didn't understand the insult. So and let me illustrate it with the story of Fukushima. You remember what happened? They look at the worst case scenario and they build, their hedge based on the worst case scenario, the 100-year worst case scenario. They don't realize that records are to be supplanted by other records by definition. And I said two things. One, in print, I explained politely that he didn't understand the dynamics of extreme events, nor did he understand that he has the tools for it, nor that he understood the distribution of extremes. You hedge yourself against extremes. That's the first one. So therefore, it's like before the stock market crash in 1987, you would have hedged for a 10% move. And hedging for a 12% move would have been foolish. And the market went down 23%. It's the same thing everywhere. So we have, I belong to a group of people in my research and things discussed here that uh, that look at the world using a little more rigorous analysis. And that was inspired by the Dutch, who have decided somehow they didn't want to drown, given that their country can be easily flooded and
Mhm.
flatland, on the below the water level. So
Yeah.
the way they build walls, they use extrapolation. So that's the technical mistake that Ilmanen committed. There's another one. He doesn't understand that the P&L from out of the money options doesn't come necessarily from the option being in the money, but the panics you had in between. So he didn't really investigate what happened 2007, 2008. You see, when the thing explode, you have a second option of selling some option
Yeah.
into panic. So that's the strategy. He didn't get it, all right. But and then they
That's
go
an
into
interesting aspect of the strategy is that you don't actually need the 20% S&P
exactly
500 move for
exactly.
the positions to pay off.
You
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 need
make
people to
most of your money.
panic and think that there's going to be such a move.
Exactly. There was something I called the Niederhoffer problem. He sold options for 5 cents. Then there was a panic, and that was in 98, but that was not related to the LTCM even. Okay, there was an explosion of wealth. He had to be liquidated. So people started buying the options, buying them out at $1, $2, whatever, up to $38.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, he was broke. The clearinghouse was broke, Refco, but they hid it. Later, they were bought by another firm that discovered the $500 million hole.
Hmm.
And at the end of the month, get what happened? Or by the end of the cycle, expiration cycle, the option ended out of the money. So for Mr. Ilmanen, these don't exist. So I'm saying so the fellow Ilmanen has no practical nor theoretical knowledge of how things work. And that's typical of that group of people who start writing in blogs and papers stuff, and finance professors have no familiarity with the real mathematics of tail events. Okay,
Yeah.
and correlation, of
Wasn't he also using historical returns of
course.
options that move 5%, like a seven
Also, there's
S&P
the
500
suckers puts.
moving 5%, not 20%?
I ignore the fact that he uses what we call sucker splits, and you buy them unconditionally. It's like you buy options, all right? That's not the way professionals do that. So I'm saying it's very naive. But Asnes got very angry when I called Ilmanen publicly. I mean, in print, I didn't call him an idiot, but although someone who knows how to read these articles would have uh,
Yeah, you
so, but
basically said he could attend school for 20 years and he never figured out.
yeah, no, but in on Twitter, where I use a more conversational form of expression, I called him, clueless. I mean, he has absolutely no
Hmm.
clue. Neither him nor, to be honest, Asnes is probably a smart guy, but he doesn't have the training. And by now it's too late, I think, for anyone to get the training. I mean, the as they say, science is hard, and also derivatives theory is very hard. So
Hmm.
you need to know a little more. But the Niederhoffer problem is just like something that everybody misses. Like you sell an option
Yeah,
for
and
and
that's you're referring to Victor Niederhoffer, the hedge fund manager. He worked under Soros in the 80s and became sort of an all-star hedge fund trader in the 90s, but then he blew up
he was selling options.
over and over again.
But blowing up, he blew up on options that ended up out of the money. So
Right.
all of these simulation
If you
is
could,
one
it's kind of
doesn't.
like LTCM. If they could have held on to their positions long enough, they would have profited, but they became illiquid, so they had to exit the positions.
But yeah, but in case of Niederhoffer, all you had to do was wait a few weeks.
Yeah,
You see, so
but he
because
couldn't. He was over leveraged.
he was monstrously levered. I mean, it is there. Let me repeat it. I've never seen any put seller who survived. Banks are put sellers, but they survive thanks to the taxpayer. You see, that's Mark's belief and my belief. We were 99% in agreement, Mark and I, but you can't be 100% in agreement with someone. You see, on general policy. Um, the strategy, as I say, of insurance in Extremistan has fared poorly over time. And it's not till Katrina that they started making money, as we have discussed. So you look at firms, they disappear, they sell options and disappear, and nobody hears about them, so you don't learn. So I mean,
Yeah,
selling volatility is not a problem. Selling the tail is the problem.
right. This is the same thing that happened in the Great Financial Crisis with the credit default swaps on mortgages. People were selling the volatility on the mortgages, and they were doing sort of elaborate strategies where they were selling it on triple A's, buying it on triple B's, not realizing that the triple A's were going to also blow up, and
Yeah,
that's
they
what
didn't, yes,
immolated the banks.
yeah. The,
Was
the problem is they didn't realize that your rating is stochastic, just like correlation. Correlation is 70%, okay, and maybe negative 70%. Just like the rating, it may have an error rate. So if you inject error
Hmm.
rate in the system, you have different results. Same thing with correlation. Your hedge becomes different if you have what I call stochastic correlation, or a stochastic form of correlation that is not tractable, which is what we have.
Hmm.
So the other thing, I mean, this is generalized for outside finance. When you see the linear regression, if one of the variables is fat-tailed, that regression means nothing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, correlation models in general just they work in normal, the day-to-day markets. But in
They don't
your
work.
extremistan world, they don't work.
They don't work in day-to-day markets. People have the illusion that they work in day-to-day markets. They don't quite work, in day-to-day markets. But
So you say that they don't ever work.
it's because uh, when you don't have a lot of movement, so necessarily whatever you have will appear to be stable.
Hmm.
But to capture really, you can use correlation if you need to have a very large N, which is what Renaissance has or had, and a lot of dimensionality and a lot of trading, and then you compensate that effect. And even then, correlation may not work. You're just absorbing bid and ask.
Hmm.
You see, you're absorbing bid and
Yeah,
ask.
well, I mean, doesn't a stat arb high frequency fund, they're trading correlations, but they're very short term, you know,
No, it's because they're absorbing bid and
sub-second,
ask.
millisecond
Yeah, but they're
correlation.
absorbing bid and ask. You see, and the error in correlation is swamped by
So
whether
it's more of a liquidity trade.
exactly they're liquidity trading, and if
Mhm.
someone supplies something and hedging with something else, that is it's not so much the reliance on correlation as much as the absorption of bid ask spread that washes out these errors
Yeah.
repeatedly, unless they're flipping continuously.
But even that trade is subject to the black swan like deleveraging events like we saw in 2007 and then the flash crash in 2011 when everybody's selling all the correlations reverse and it doesn't work. So in the extreme markets,
Yeah, and
even the
also yes.
strategy doesn't work. Renaissance almost went out of business in 2007.
I mean,
They were close. They were days.
really in
Yeah.
2007. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but ask is not sufficient to cover for that because
Yeah. I mean, it
basically,
was extreme event.
yeah, maybe it's not sufficient. I was being sort of charitable by finding an explanation to where you can salvage correlation and why you see so many or so many. You see that a few people made a career over decades, using benefiting from the structure of correlation. But I think that if you look at the cemetery of trading funds as a humongous, you'll see a lot of failed funds that had excellent correlation models.
Yeah. They make for a good story, I think, is people come to
So
believe the story and they make up reasons for why it's supposed to work, but then things change, markets change, dynamics change, and then you've leveraged this perfect trade you think you've got 20, 30 times, and it goes wrong for a few days or weeks and you're dead. That's it's gambler's ruin. It happens very quickly.
I mean,
Um,
incidentally, and this may be a little out of school here. I'm publishing a paper in genetics where I'm replacing correlation with another metric used in entropy, in information theory, and understood by computer scientists called mutual information.
hmm.
The
What is
Greek
that? Visual information?
mutual information.
Mutual information. Huh. Okay.
Yeah, so which is more adapted to
Yeah,
genetics.
I'm not familiar with that.
So I've been publishing in genetics, and that's my latest paper.
Hmm. So a different way of looking at
Yeah, actually, it came from finance. I got the idea from Kelly Criterion. Um, the 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 idea is how much would you bet on horse A, knowing the performance of horse B? You see, so the how much your
hmm.
gross, the effect of your gross betting on horse A or investing in an asset A would change from knowledge of gross and the other one. So that's mutual information. And for
Hmm.
example, if I do a straddle, okay, straddle has zero correlation with the market, but we know it has correlation with the market. But its mutual information is infinite. So in other words, it captures
Hmm.
nonlinear dependence as well, and also much more adapted to compounding. Because one thing I didn't want to be technical, but I have to mention it about Mark's idea is that compounding is what matters. You
Yeah.
see, so the mutual information affects compounding. It's
Hmm.
about how
Okay.
we will compound knowing this. It's a little technical, but
I'll take your word for it. I can't say I understand it, but it sounds interesting.
it is actually more powerful than correlation.
Compounding is, I mean, that's goes back to Buffett. That's uh,
That goes back
old
to
school.
that goes back to anyone who has worked with exponential.
Yeah. Yeah. Way before Buffett, I'm sure.
Yeah, but before Buffett.
Um,
But the smart people rediscover things on their own. They
yeah.
have intuition of things on their own.
I'm
Anybody
sure
who's
Crassus really knew about compounding.
yeah, multiplication, multiplicative effect is the same as compounding.
Yeah.
One is over time, and the other one is over space. You see, it's the same. It's the
Yeah.
same problem. I mean, smart people, to me, who are grounded in the real world, understand what I call violent non-linearities. Non-linearities are monstrously consequential. Compounding is one of them. Multiple
Hmm.
effects is another.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's an idea that the book uh, hits on in the beginning. Actually, is discussing why investors or fund managers actually had this idea in their mind of exponential risk, before actual, health experts figured it out. Because it's just for certain kinds of investors, compounding is that's the way they look at the world.
Yes,
And so they looked at the R naught of COVID and were like, holy shit, this is compounding. This thing will spread exponentially.
exactly.
And
And,
yeah,
and then you were asking me if you ask what does Mark do for a living, I say he thinks in terms of compounding. And if you ask
yeah,
what I do for a living, I think in terms of multiplicative effects.
right.
So there's just a different, but it's the same. In the end, it's the same intuition. And to me, the function as a state, is only manage extremes. See, and the difference with Mark is Mark thinks that by definition, because they're bureaucrats, they're going to mess it up.
They're messing up. Yeah,
So, so
right.
the idea of the state is there to manage extremes. That's it. As a tail risk manager, the state as a tail risk manager. We don't want the state elsewhere.
All right. So let's get into chapter 16. The title is This Civilization is Finished. And that comes from a lecture that Rupert Read was making around, uh, well, after you met, actually. But the chapter gets into the story of how you met Rupert Read, who's a British philosopher, uh, taught at the time at East Anglia University. You traveled there, I think it was 2012. You traveled there to give a talk, and you met Rupert. I think he'd invited you, and he told me about the story of how you guys went out to a pub and were having some single malts. And he said, he brought up the idea of the precautionary principle. He said, what you're talking about to me sounds like this is the precautionary principle. So you started discussing it, and from there that leads to your work on the paper that you published a few years ago. But do you want to talk a bit about that? How you
All I
met
remember
Rupert and
is that we went to a pub near the university and they were serving. You couldn't see the liquid in a glass, and my first remark is, "This is called inflation."
deflation?
Inflation, because you had to order 3 or 4 drinks to just taste it. Okay, so the quantities. Um,
They were either really cheap or it
I
was
don't.
really good single malt.
Okay, I don't have a complete recollection of the sequence of whether I got that letter from
The
uh,
Brian Eno, yeah. That
from
happened to April 2013.
okay,
It was about a year after you met with Rupert.
so it started. I think it started with, so we had the paper. No, I started with my reply to Brian Eno, and then I added Rupert as a philosophy advisor. Rupert and I had written about religion as a mitigator of tail risk, because you can transmit
Sure.
interdicts through generations. You don't have to really explain the wheel, and a lot of risks one should not be taking. And it's hard to explain. So we were working on religion as a tail risk uh,
Hmm.
transmitter. In other words, interdict and interdict. We don't do this, all right? So for whatever reason, people who are religious will stick to it. You see, they won't go second guess the rule and exit the gene pool when the the incident that was the reason for the rule happens. All right. So and I think, okay, so the sequence is Rupert has a deep knowledge of the legal and philosophical uh, uh, sort of like background for the principle. And I think we started teaming up, and then we added Yanir. I don't know how
Yeah.
Yanir got in, but it was a weird group of people because and even Mark and I wrote one piece that we published in the New York Times on
Right.
GMOs invoking the principle. And Mark, as a libertarian, was accepting the principle. That meant he welcoming it. See, not in my backyard. So, and if it affects my backyard, I don't want it. So we focused on GMOs, and
Yeah.
sure enough, we had a smear campaign. And smear campaigns usually try to harm you, and we weren't harmed, but had like something of several hundred, if not maybe more than 1,000 letters sent to every department at NYU telling people that I was a fraud. And the dean at it,
Right. So just for people watching this, in response to the precautionary principle paper that you published with Rupert and Yunir Bar-Yam uh, of the New England Complexity Institute, is that
yes,
and in this paper, you use genetically modified organisms as an example of a systemic risk that the principle should be applied to because it can be multiplicative, it can affect the entire world, and it has risks of ruin, among
exactly,
other properties.
exactly. The way I viewed it is just like COVID, a pandemic, except that it affects the ecosystem.
And it
And
has hidden risks, right? There's potential outcomes that are unknowable.
exactly,
Uh,
and if you talk to the people who discuss the risk of GMOs, you realize they're clueless, and they're usually the journalists who were brought out as risk experts, because they say, look, they didn't kill anybody, and they don't understand that GMO inside your body is not may not be harming the environment, but GMO in the environment will harm the environment. But what was
so there
interesting,
was a smear campaign that got ginned up by some
Monsanto,
companies,
Monsanto.
Monsanto.
I name it
Yeah.
Monsanto, and I was naming it, and they would hire all these losers who probably just for a living do smear campaign and propaganda, and they would write letters to the university saying why I should be removed as an anti-science person, and then you realize, you know, people wonder what's so anti-science about Nassim. Well, he has a position at university, he deals with risks, and he's saying there's tail risk. Okay. And of course, some idiots getting the letter panic. Oh, you got to rectify, fix your reputation. But but there are idiots everywhere, and people who are afraid of any noise. And academics can be very fragile, particularly if they don't have tenure. And Monsanto's business had been to smear academics in such a way as to destroy their career and give an example to others. Even there's a fellow who passed who called me up, a friend of Ralph Nader, who called me up to tell me that in his days Monsanto would sue the printer because in London you could sue a printer, the printer of the journal. It's just
Hmm.
like these bullying methods. I mean, so you realize, I mean, it's not sustainable, to prop up your science with stuff like that. And then when people tell you, oh, we did a risk analysis, they don't know what it means. And they couldn't grasp the difference between uh, there's something that's like jumping from an airplane or jumping, from the first floor window. They don't realize that you have acceleration of harm, and when you skip steps, they say, "Well, we've been doing genetic engineering. How? Well, you know, breeding." Yeah, they say, "No, it's not the same." It's like there's a difference. You cannot harm yourself walking. Okay, if you hit, I mean, maybe 1 in 10 million may harm herself or himself walking.
Hmm.
You can harm yourself driving at 400 miles an hour. See,
Yeah.
so genetic breeding is slow and has other attributes. You're not skipping steps.
Yeah, and you got attacked for being anti-science. You were even lumped in with anti-vax people.
At times,
Ironically, for
yes.
Rupert, you were called climate or lumped in with climate change deniers.
Yeah, yeah, all kind of stuff. But I mean, they try to. But the interesting thing about vax, about at the time, vaccine, I said the vaccine is inside your system. You see, it's not multiplicative. And the other thing, I had written a book called Anti-Fragility, Anti-Fragile.
Mhm.
All right. And what does a vax do is it's like a drop of poison or effective or ineffective, but in quantities and in such a way as to cause a reaction on your part to upregulate your defense system, particularly against targeting that particular virus. But it's okay. I mean, when I went, it's good to go through smear campaigns. I had gone through a few smear campaigns, and because it really, as I write in Anti-Fragile, or actually written as Fragile before that, like I was prescient about what was going to happen to me after my second smear campaign. That you get stronger. You survive smear campaign. You basically have no paranoia. You see, I know people who were not subject to a smear campaign. I won't name the person. Very, very big hotshot. And the person gets angry if someone has a comment about him on social media, about his research. Whereas if being subjected to a smear campaign, you couldn't care less. You get used, you're so used to it. I have thousands and thousands. You Google them, you find thousands and thousands of those.
Mhm. Right. It's what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, the old Nietzschean.
Exactly,
um,
exactly.
So
But
should we get to a few
interesting.
questions
It is
from
very interesting. The fragile people are the ones who engage in smear campaign.
right.
Yeah, that is very because once you expose them, they get very, very, very scared.
Yeah, I mean there's a reason they're lashing out. There's a vulnerability. They wouldn't engage in a smear campaign if they didn't
And also
have
people,
some.
the individuals involved in smear campaign are individual fragile. But I mentioned the head of, I even forgot his name and the name of his firm. At the firm, there's an agency, PR agency hired by someone working by a firm advising Monsanto. So he had layers of, of accountability.
Right. Yeah,
So
no, I remember you telling me about that. It
yeah,
was
so
coordinated and paid for.
yeah, no, so that firm and that hired the firm that does internet smear campaigning, and I named the chairman of the thing in skin in the game. The minute I posted it, okay, everything stopped. I had the name of the chairperson, the skin of the game. Put the skin of the game as the person organizing that. But and the interesting thing is you don't even have to punish the people who engage in smear campaigning. Just watch what happens to their career over time.
Hmm. All right, so you posted on Twitter, you asked readers or viewers to ask questions for me and for you. So I figured we could get a few of these in real quick. Um, so this is an interesting one. We talked about it, I think, in the first talk that we had. It's from Joshua, uh, and it says, "Does universe have a forecasting element to decide when to buy puts?"
No, no.
No.
No, by definition, it's not robust to have a forecasting element. What if you're wrong on your forecast?
Yeah,
It so happens that when the environment is not forecasting an event, you buy the protection much cheaper.
right. I think that answers that question. Uh, okay, so this one's a bit awkward, I guess, for me. It says a question to you, Nassim, on journalism. because you're known as a critic of reporters and journalism. Can you talk about what makes Scott, in your view, different from the rest of journalists?
I would say more rigorous, but I'm not gonna. I'm not known to compliment people, but I would say that um, I've met a lot of very competent journalists, and you classify journalists in three categories. The first category is those who have true skin in the game. In other words, they go to Gaza or other places and they're exposed to risks, physical risks. That's the second one is people who are rigorous and they go deeply into subject. They study thoroughly. And the third ones are of the caliber of Nocera that just produce noise and confuse people. You see, and there's the ones I criticize are full by randomness. Uh, they're superficial. They produce noise, and they don't get the subject. But let's remember that I don't know if you know the anecdote of Einstein sending an article to the New York Times. It was a lecture he gave, and the editor of the New York Times found a mistake. And then they called Einstein. They said that he found a mistake, and Einstein said, "Yes, he's correct." So they are. I mean, journalism has it's a broad category, just like economists. They are smart economists. You see,
Mm.
it's just like talking about the establishment. So I'm not critical of the first and second category of journalists. I'm critical
Yeah.
of the third, and these are the guys were small, not journalists so much as journalism, in the sense that they have to explain every move. They'll say, "Oh, the market went down," and then they attribute the move to it because Saddam. As I wrote in the Black Swan, because Saddam was caught, the market went down, and then 2 hours later, the market went up because Saddam was caught. Because they had two events, right? And
Right.
they made the link between them. So that's the
Well,
full.
I know the perfect example of that is the stock market rose in early trading because oil prices were up, causing shares of Exxon to rise 10%. In the afternoon, the stock market fell because oil prices rose, sparking economic concerns about a recession and consumer
There you go.
spending.
There you go.
It's
So
just
you have
the same
you have
exact thing.
exactly. So you don't need to give people an explanation and or deal with noise. You see, but the second category, I mean, it's not just you. There are a lot of people in the second category of people who do thorough, who get to know subject inside out and do thorough research on it, and also write in newspapers. So
Yeah, well, I spent some time traveling around strange places in Africa too, so I've had some of the first category experiences with guys with guns standing near me. Um, so, okay, here's another one that's kind of interesting. I know I talked to Mark about this. It says if everybody would follow Universe's strategy, would insurance prices then get so high the tail hedges no longer are financially attractive? So if everybody were to use Universe's price models,
if
then there'd be no cheap insurance to profit from tail events.
it's like you know the story of the Persian king who told the Spartans, "If I invade you, I'm going to do so and so and so," and then the answer of the Spartans was characteristically laconic because laconic comes from Sparta.
Hmm.
And you know what it was?
No.
If.
If. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so that
Yeah. I mean, I know Mark's
next
response
one.
to this is that, yeah, sure, if people would do it, then that probably would make the strategy less profitable, but there he has no confidence that anybody will.
There
So
we go. I'm saying if.
if, yeah. Uh, Okay. So this one, there's several varieties of this, and this is something I actually got asked by my editor, who you esteem so highly. Uh,
I mean, he may be a great editor, he just doesn't know how to work with titles.
yeah. So he says, so many people believe and understand what Mark and Nassim have achieved and appreciate it, uh, but the small guy can't gain access. Is there any plan to create this is written by a guy named Vince, the Vince Value Fund, allowing minions to get this universal uh, access as one player?
Uh, I don't know. All right. So it's always easier to say I don't know.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no.
So
This is not a strategy that everybody can have access to. Unfortunately, it's not scalable to
but
the billions and billions of people.
I have written in the past that if you're in the market and you're a small guy, small person, okay, you should not be in the market. For several reasons. If your job is a butcher, say you have a butcher shop, focus on being a butcher. If your job is doing smear campaigning for Monsanto, focus on that as source of income because everybody, for some weird reason, everybody thinks that making money in the market is possible because they hear stories and there's some activity that visibly seems to be open to anyone. So the best way for the individual is to focus on their own investment because they become very naive when dealing with funds. And to give you an example, someone has a bakery, they're good at baking, they save $100,000. They know every supplier, everything, and then guess what? They give the $100,000 to a fund manager, not knowing anything. Okay, so the same the scrutiny they have in their own business, okay, is completely lifted. The skepticism is completely lifted when it comes to financial markets. So I tell people, make money from your business and use financial markets for preservation.
Yeah, I think that's where the concern is the preservation, because the principle of tail hedging is you clip that tail risk.
Yes, yes,
If
but then
people
they
are
want,
told, well, you could lose 50%, or you could lose 30%, and that's a big loss, especially if you're going into retirement.
but maybe they should not be in the market. That's the whole idea. See, so it's a philosophical thing, point, and anyway, it doesn't apply here because also if they have, a pension, we're dealing with their pension.
Mm,
See, but individually, I think that people should be very careful and focus on their own business.
yeah, I think that's good advice. Um, if if you focus on whatever skill it is that you have, uh, the likelihood that you're going to compound your wealth or at least grow it uh, more than you would if you spent time trying to analyze the
Yeah,
stock market,
there you go.
um, you'll probably do better. And somebody asked, another
One
question was, am I invested in the stock market?
hold on, was one exception for dentists, because I remember in the beginning, dentists were vastly more sophisticated uh, in their understanding of gold dynamics. Supply and demand were the buyers because they they were effectively gold traders,
Right.
and there were very few gold traders in Europe, and many dentists became full-time gold traders.
So dentists became gold
Gold
traders.
arbitrageurs, yeah, gold arbitrageurs. But that's a nice exception.
Very interesting. Okay, well, we've gotten through another 6 chapters. Um, so
So
should we
it looks like, yeah, we should
reconvene
stop
again?
here and we'll continue later. Um, Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Scott, again. We don't see your books in the background. Next time, I guess we'll see them. No? All right.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right. Bye now.